Chapter 50. A travesty. Are you sure all of this is necessary? It would make me feel loads better, Auntie. Amelia Bones smiled softly at her niece and lightly patted the young girl's cheek. They were sitting in the kitchen enjoying their breakfast, but Amelia had a lot on her mind this morning, seeing as Harry Potter's trial was late that afternoon. It had been a week since they had arrested him, and they currently had him locked up in a ministry holding cell. The minister had not let anyone in to speak with him, but he had appointed a few Aurors to watch over him day and night because, according to Fudge, the boy was capable of anything. Dumbledore had tried to get in to see Potter multiple times, as had Sirius Black and the Flamels, but Fudge refused to let them through. They tried pleading with the minister to see reason, but Fudge had had enough, and Dumbledore was booted out of the Wizengamot, thereby losing his chief warlock position. Fudge was also currently trying to get Dumbledore out of the International Confederation of Wizards, and Amelia knew he was close to achieving that goal as well. As for herself, Amelia was unsure about the whole situation. Her rational, logical mind was telling her that something was up because nothing about this situation felt right. However, it was her memories of the last war that brought up feelings of dread, and a part of her didn't want to believe it was true. As Amelia looked across the table at Susan though, she knew she needed to take every precaution available just in case. She sighed loudly and nodded. "All right. I will take your essay ideas into suggestion, but I really don't think we have anything to worry about. There have been no hints about you-know-who returning. Auntie, Harry Potter is a lot of things, but a liar is not one of them," Susan said as she squared her shoulders just a bit. "Not to mention, Cedric was there in that graveyard too, and he knows what he saw. I believe them both. Tell me what you know about Harry Potter," Amelia said curiously, as she leaned back in her chair. "Well, for a Slytherin he is very nice, but not in a fake way. He doesn't befriend you just because you might be able to give, or do something for him later down the road. At the end of every year he forms study groups to help anyone that needs help better understanding things. He always patient, kind, funny, and truthfully, he's very laid back about most things." "What things is he not laid back about?" Amelia asked as she stirred her coffee. "Safety for one thing. If he thinks something is unsafe, he speaks his mind about it. In fact, it's because of him and Gordy that we had to write the essays to begin with. They got into Gryffindor Tower and made themselves at home in their common room." She giggled. Professor McGonagall was angry, but Hermione told her that they did it to prove a point. Apparently Gordy scolded all of Gryffindor House for shouting out their password where anyone could hear it. They put themselves and their housemates in danger by doing that. Anyone could get in there and cause harm to them and their friends. "I see," Amelia said with a raised eyebrow. "What else can you tell me?" "That's it mostly," Susan said with a shrug. "I don't really know him that well, but I do join his study groups at the end of every year, and one time I was having a difficult time in Transfiguration. He noticed my frustration, got up out of his seat, and came to help me. I got the spell shortly after that." "So you don't think he's capable of murder?" Amelia asked. Susan sighed loudly and furrowed her brow. "I don't know. Cold-blooded murder, no, I don't think so, but killing someone in order to defend himself, yes, I do think he would." "Really?" Amelia said with slight shock. "Harry's different, Auntie. He's not about different, he's just different. He doesn't look at things the same we do, like magic itself for instance. I read in the paper where he said that magic is magic, it just depends on the caster's intentions which makes it light or dark." "Yes, I do recall that Rita Skeeter article," Amelia said with a nod. "Auntie, I believe what Harry says. I really do. I believe that you-know-who is back, but I don't believe that he killed Peter Pettigrew out of spite. If he killed Pettigrew, he did it out of self-defense. But he is saying that he didn't do it at all. He claims that you-know-who's killing curse bounced off of him and hit Pettigrew." "Susan, That's a little hard to believe, Amelia said with a bit of frustration. I know it is, Auntie, but how did he survive that night when he was a baby? No one knows. Maybe he is just special, Susan replied. Amelia sighed and nodded. Okay. I still don't know what to think, but I will be objective about. His trial is today, and I already have run the magical signature that killed Pettigrew against the snake Dumbledore handed me. Apparently they were going to feed it to the basilisk, but changed their mind shortly after. I can say that the two magical signatures don't match, but the drawback with magical signatures is, they can't tell us who cast the spells. So do what Gordy suggested in the paper. Have Harry kill an old already dying mouse or something. Let him prove his innocence. Susan pleaded. All right, Susan. I will do what I can, but the minister is being a very big pain in my dot. Well, you understand. He's convinced himself that Potter is already guilty. Since when have you let that stop you? Susan asked with a smirk, but then she looked at Amelia with pleading eyes. Auntie, you're Harry's only hope. Please try to do all you can for him. I don't believe he killed Pettigrew. I really don't. Amelia took a deep breath and smiled at her. All right. I will do all that I can to see that he gets a fair trial. Susan threw her arms around her aunt and hugged her tightly. Thank you, Auntie, she whispered. Harry deserves a fair trial. He is the boy who lived twice. Salazar was cold, hungry, and tired. For a week he had sat in his barren cell with hardly any food or drink. Wandless warming charms only did so much, but because of the lack of food and water, Salazar couldn't hold them in place for long. He chuckled to himself. One would think I'd be used to this, he thought with a shiver, as he watched another arrow walk by his cell. Salazar was glad he left Nora with Neville, but he missed her right now. At least she would be entertaining company, even if all she'd do is threaten to bite anyone who walked by. He knew he could have ran, apparated off the train, or went with Godric's suggestion of letting Nahum take him home when they got to King's Cross, but honestly, what would have been the point? Running made it look like he was guilty. And guilty he was not. He knew his trial was today, so that was some good news, though he knew that nearly everything was stacked against him, and what made it worse was he really had no definitive plan. He could outwit individual people quite easily, but a whole courtroom full of witches and wizards was something else entirely. Crooked politicians were in the business of winning, and Fudge was determined to see him in Azkaban. He had a plan for getting out of Azkaban though, should it come to that. Godric would send Nahum for him, and then he would just take out the Polyjuice Rock and continue on. Harry Potter would be a wanted fugitive, but no one would be looking for a grown, still alive, Salazar Slytherin. Salazar jumped a mile as someone banged on his cell door. Get up, Potter. Dawlish snarled. It's time for your trial. Salazar glared at him, but stood up, and let the man lead him away. The courtroom was packed with reporters, ministry officials, and a few curious people of the general public, so Salazar had a hard time spotting Sirius, Remus, Dumbledore, and the others as he was roughly shoved into a chair. He heard Sirius start shouting obscenities at Dawlish, but Remus was able to get him calmed down pretty quickly. The chair was large and had heavy chains, but Salazar was startled when they tightly wrapped around his hands and ankles. He quirked an eyebrow at Percy, who was sitting a few feet away with an ashen face as he watched him. It appeared as if he would be taking notes during the trial. It's all right, he mouthed, but Percy only shook his head no ever so slightly. Salazar looked at him a bit confused, but didn't have time to dwell on it as the members of the Wizengamot filed in. He did his best not to glare at anybody, but since Fudge was grinning at him, as if he'd caught a mouse, Salazar found it kind of hard not to. Fudge raised a hand for silence, and the murmuring died down immediately. The trial of Harry Potter will now begin, Fudge said a bit too gleefully. The charge is murder by use of the killing curse. If convicted, he will spend the rest of his life in Azkaban. Unlikely. Salazar mumbled. "What was that, boy?" Fudge said, snapped as he glared down at him. "I said unlikely," Salazar repeated a bit more loudly, causing everyone to start murmuring again. Fudge frowned, but Salazar only chuckled. He knew that this was being broadcast over the Wizarding wireless network, and he knew that the whole Wizarding world was listening in. "Harry Potter, you are charged with the murder of Peter Pettigrew. How do you plead?" Fudge asked. "Not guilty," Salazar replied without hesitation. "And yet you brought back his body as a trophy, so that you could show your godfather, Sirius Black, that you had murdered the man responsible for betraying your parents, thereby leading to their deaths. Is that right?" "No, I brought back Pettigrew to show that." "I'm sorry, Mr. Potter, but we are not here for tall tales." "Where's your evidence that I killed him?" Salazar asked quickly. "Evidence, Mr. Potter?" Fudge asked with a laugh. "We don't need any. You were seen by no less than 10 people clutching the dead man's body. You came back by an illegal portk, with him in your hands. I believe it was you, Mr. Potter, that turned the cup into a portk in the first place. You knew where Pettigrew was, and so you used the last task as a way to kill him. Then you and Dumbledore decided to pass it off as you know who." "That's a bunch of bull, Minister. What about Cedric Diggory?" Salazar shouted. "You confronted him," Fudge yelled back. "You took a trusting friend, and tried to turn him into a pliable witness." "That's not true," a voice suddenly shouted. "We were in a graveyard with Pettigrew and a tombstone with Tom Riddle's name on it." "Quiet," Fudge shouted. "Hurras, escort Mr. Diggory out of here." Salazar couldn't turn in his seat, but he heard Cedric fighting them off as he kept yelling. "Harry's telling the truth. You know who is back," he shouted, just as the Urras managed to drag him out the door. "He's not back," Fudge roared. Then he began setting off loud blasts from his wand to silence the courtroom. When order had finally been restored, Fudge glared down at Salazar. "You know who is not back," he repeated. "This is all nonsense." "It's not. I'm telling you, Voldemort cast the killing curse at me, and it bounced off of me and hit Pettigrew," Salazar said, trying to keep his temper under control. Yes, a likely excuse because it can't be tested," Fudge said, wagging his finger at him. "The killing curse bounced off of you. It's the biggest load of tosh." "Then what about the magical signatures?" Hum, a girlish voice said loudly, cutting Salazar off. He glanced at her and noticed that she was wearing a rather repulsive-looking pink hat. "Minister, if I may, why not test this so-called defense? Why doesn't someone cast the killing curse at the boy? He's going to prison anyway. When he dies, so be it." "I disagree with this." Amelia Bones jumped up and shouted suddenly. "I have already tested the magical signatures, and I can tell you, the one that killed the snake does not match the one that killed Pettigrew." "Quiet," Fudge shouted, turning red in the face as the courtroom reporters began shouting questions at Amelia. Once calm had been restored, Amelia straightened her monocle. "I cannot condone Madam Umbridge's suggestion. We don't know if Mr. Potter is immune to everyone's killing curse, or just you know whose." "He's not." "I'm not saying he is, Minister," Amelia interrupted with a cold glare. "I was talking about the first time." "Oh," Fudge replied, looking a bit sheepish, but then he straightened his hat, which had gone crooked on his head, and straightened up a bit. "Evidence may show that the two magical signatures don't match, but I don't think we need to carry on with this pomp and flair any longer. I believe." "Let me prove." Salazar started to shout, only to be silenced by Dawlish, who had a very wicked gleam in his eyes, causing Salazar to glare daggers at him. "Thank you for silencing him, Dawlish," Fudge said with a nod. "Now, as I was saying, I believe that Harry Potter killed Peter Pettigrew in cold blood and out of spite. He did this knowingly, willingly, and without remorse. As is our law on the use of unforgivables, there is no need for a vote. Harry Potter, you are hereby found. Is it because you're in denial? Salazar shouted, after wondrously reversing the silencing charm. Are you scared that if I prove I'm innocent? Once again Dawlish hit him with a silencing charm, but he immediately reversed it. Stupefy! Salazar cried, turning his hand ever so slightly, and dropping Dawlish just as he brandished his wand again. If I prove that I'm innocent, that it will mean that you have been wrong. Protego! He cried, throwing up a shield to protect himself from the witch with the ugly pink hat. And it will be solid evidence that volume. Stupefy! He cried, stunning the pink-hatted witch. Voldemort is back. Salazar finally finished. The entire courtroom was in an uproar. Salazar could hear Sirius cheering him on, and he saw many flashbulbs going off as the reporters furiously snapped pictures. Fudge just stood there open-mouthed and stared at him, but then the minister glared. Harry Potter, you are found guilty of murder. Horrors, take him away, he shouted. Voldemort is back. You will see soon enough, and this time, Harry Potter won't be there to save your slimy, crooked, no good sorry asses. Salazar bellowed, after casting a voice-amplifying charm. There was so much chaos, flashbulbs, shouting, screaming, protesting, and roars in the courtroom that Salazar never saw who stunned him. When are we getting him out? A furious-looking Hermione demanded, just as Godric, Merlin, Nicholas, Perenelle, Sirius, and Remus walked in the door. They had all returned to Merlin's cottage in Ireland to regroup, and she had apparently been listening over the wizarding wireless radio. They railroaded him. She continued in frustration. I sat here and heard everything. I'll send Nahum when it gets a little darker. They need time to process him in, and get him into a cell. Godric replied, looking a bit weary from the day's events. He knows we need to wait a bit, or else it will look like he had help and then all of us will be under suspicion. Salazar should have killed them all. An angry female voice suddenly shouted. They all turned around to see Lily, James, and Harry in Sirius's enlarged mirror looking downright ticked off. I loved that bit at the end though. Fudge is going to find himself without a job when Voldemort finally shows himself. James added with a chuckle. What is Dumbledore doing? Lily asked curiously. He is doing his part, and is looking to appeal, but we don't think he is going to be successful. Perenelle said with a frustrated sigh. I do agree with Salazar though. They didn't want him to prove his innocence because it would prove Voldemort has returned. I do believe you're right, my dear, Nicholas said with a weary sigh. I just wish I could get a hold of that witch that suggested someone hit him with a killing curse. We know it wouldn't hurt him, but still, to suggest it is just unbelievable, Sirius said, sinking down onto the couch and shaking his head. I wanted to hex her. Who was that, by the way? Godric asked curiously. Madame Dolores Umbridge. She is the senior undersecretary to the minister, Nicholas replied with a scowl. And she is a nasty piece of work. Apparently. Lily growled. But what are we going to do now, Gordy? Hermione asked with a slight sob. Harry won't be able to go back to Hogwarts. He'll be a fugitive. I know he can hide easily enough, because all he has to do is take out the Polyjuice Rock, but then he won't be with us at school. I don't know, Hermione, Godric said as he patted her shoulder lightly. We will figure something out. I bet Voldemort is having a laugh over this. James muttered bitterly. Probably, but once the news gets out of Salazar's escape, he won't be laughing long. Voldemort will be looking for a 14-year-old Salazar, not a fully grown one. Perenelle spat, causing Harry to laugh. Voldemort will never see him coming, he said. Everyone chuckled over that, but then a silvery Wolverine suddenly bounded through an open window and stopped in front of Hermione. What's the plan? Neville's voice rang out. Blaze is rearing to go. He says we need to get him out as soon as possible, and Nora is here throwing a fit and threatening to bite everything that moves. I just hope she doesn't bite me." The patroness finished with a slight quiver in its voice, which caused the others to crack a smile. Hermione cast her own eye to patroness and sent a reply back saying they were working on it, and Sirius left to go inform his cousin Andromeda and her family. Tonks had been reporting in about Salazar's well-being throughout the week as best she could, but because of her black family ties, she wasn't allowed in to see him. Remus left to go to the Weasleys, but after he left Merlin turned to Godric. "I think it's time we go. I want to have the castle under a Fidelius as soon as possible. I will need your help, seeing as I can't cast the charm and be the secret keeper for it." Godric nodded. "All right. Salazar will likely want to go home, shower, eat, and get a decent night's rest before heading there though." "Indeed," Merlin said with a nod. Then he turned to Nicholas, Perenelle, and Hermione, who was gazing up at him slightly starry-eyed. "Help yourselves to some tea and biscuits if you wish. We will be back shortly." They nodded, and before they knew it, it was just them and the Potters. Perenelle sighed loudly as she sat down on a chair. "Did they tell Neville's gran and Blaze's mum the truth yet?" Harry asked, causing Hermione to nod. "They did, and needless to say, they feel better knowing Salazar and Godric are a part of this. Neville says his gran was shocked to meet Godric, and Blaze's mum was speechless for nearly 10 minutes. She giggled. Though they both nearly fainted when Merlin introduced himself. Did they tell them the truth, or did they tell them the reincarnation rubbish? James asked with a chuckle. "Both," Perenelle said. "They did that so if Albus asks any questions they wouldn't be surprised. They took oaths about everything though." "So they know we are alive then?" Lily asked, causing Perenelle to nod. "Well, that's good. I don't know Blaze's mum that well, but I always liked Augusta Longbottom," James said. "Frank and I had been childhood friends for many years, but when we got to Hogwarts, we ended up hanging out with different people. We were always friends, just not as close as we had been. I wonder if there is anything Merlin can do for Frank and Alice. Surely if anyone can, it's him," Lily said, looking at James. "There is an intriguing thought," Nicholas said as he gazed at everyone thoughtfully. "I never thought much about it truthfully." "Do you think the stone can help?" Perenelle asked. "I don't know, but I will certainly look into it. That young man has suffered his fair share of heartaches and deserves to have this looked into," he replied, but then turned to Hermione. "Please don't say anything to him though, just in case. I don't want to get his hopes up if it turns out nothing can be done." "Yes sir, I understand," she nodded. "Hermione, have you figured out Merlin's secret place yet?" Harry asked with a grin. Her eyes lit up, but Perenelle burst out laughing. "My dear Harry, she figured it out in 3 seconds flat." Harry started laughing too, but Hermione blushed. "I'm excited. I never thought. It never occurred. No wonder no one in the Mole world can find it. It's behind Mole repelling charms. They now pass it off as a myth and a legend. Our magic. I dare say that I can't wait to see. Wait, what were we talking about?" Lily asked, looking a bit confused. "I don't know. You were going to say something about. I can't remember," James said, looking around. "Something to with Merlin," Perenelle said as she stared at them all. "I hate it when that happens," Hermione muttered with a frustrated sigh. "It's like I have just forgotten something." They all stared around at one another with blank looks, but none of them could remember what they had been discussing. "I implore you to see reason, Cornelius," Albus shouted. "You can't keep Harry locked. He committed murder, Dumbledore," the minister shouted back. They were in the Auror office, standing in front of Amelia's desk, and having a serious row. All the Aurors were standing around, watching with interest and wide eyes, but Salazar was leaning against the doors to his cell, with his ears pressed up against the bars trying to hear what they were screaming. The door leading to the cells was slightly open, but his guards watched him like a hawk, ready for anything he might do. Apparently his little display of wondrous magic had caused them to become jittery. Fudge had already come into the cell block and purposely snapped his yew and basilisk hide wand in half, right in front of him. That ticked Salazar off because he was rather fond of that wand, so he sent a very powerful stinging jinx at the man's face. It was a wonder Fudge could even talk at all right now, much less scream his lungs out. Salazar had been awakened just before he had been tossed back in his cell, and he had a splitting headache because of hitting his head on the back wall. Dawlish had loved that. "You know who is not back?" Fudge was yelling. "He is, and you are fixing to throw our only hope into Azkaban. Harry is a child. He didn't do this." Salazar had to hand it to Dumbledore. He was certainly making a scene, but he knew the headmaster's efforts were not going to be enough. "He did. He did," Fudge yelled. "A killing curse does not bounce off of anyone. I don't know what you are teaching up at that school, but clearly you are teaching foolish notions. Which is why I am sending someone from the ministry to evaluate the staff, curriculum, and the students. Everything taught will be looked at closely, Dumbledore, mark my words. You have condemned us all. When Voldemort, he's not, makes his move, you will be seen as the fool you are," Dumbledore roared, causing several things in the Auror office to rattle violently. Salazar was actually highly impressed. "Are you threatening me? You better watch yourself, Dumbledore. Get out of here. Get out of here right now, and I don't want to see you back in here for a very long time," Fudge shouted. "You mark my words, when Voldemort makes his move, you will be clamoring to get Harry out of Azkaban, but then it will be too late. Imagine what the Dementors are going to do to a near 15-year-old boy. You, Cornelius Fudge, have given Voldemort the upper hand. Just remember that," Dumbledore said, trying to rein in his temper as he stormed out of the Auror offices. Salazar sighed and shook his head, but then he chuckled. He couldn't wait to see what Fudge's reaction was going to be when he escaped. Albus sighed as he sat down behind his desk. He had just flew in from the ministry, and he was still trying to calm himself down. However, he had just sat down and called for a cup of tea when a small knock sounded at his door. He sighed tiredly and looked up. "Come in," he called out. A very frazzled-looking Minerva came in, and after seating herself, looked at Albus expectantly. He chuckled slightly and offered her some tea. "I suppose you were listening over the radio?" "Oh yes," she replied. "Poppy, myself, and Emeralda were all in the Great Hall listening to the broadcast. Miss Emeralda is in a right furious state, judging by all the loud hissing and tail-flicking." "How did you know I was back inside the castle?" he asked curiously. She smiled a bit as she set her teacup down. "A patroness message from George Weasley. Apparently they had been watching the map for your return." "A patroness message?" Albus asked, looking a bit startled. "Oh yes, Remus taught Mr. Potter and Mr. Ruffin how to make a patroness talk after your little mail redirection board stunt. It was while you were under the Imperius. They had been teaching the children the patroness charm for some time, and once they had mastered the charm, they taught the children how to make them talk." "I see," Albus said with a thoughtful sigh. "Yes, I now recall Remus getting angry at me in the Great Hall. Thankfully Lucius never found out about that, though he did ask me what it all meant. I never told him. If I may, what are the children's patronesses?" "Well, Miss Granger's is an otter, Mr. Longbottom's is a wolverine, Mr. Zarbini's is a bear, and the twins have weasels." "Just like Arthur's patroness then?" Albus nodded. Minerva also nodded, but then she looked at him. "How did he look, Albus? Did he look okay? Judging by all the commotion at the end, I'm guessing he performed wondrous magic." "He did, and much to the surprise of everyone there, except us of course. He looked pale, slightly dirty, and frumpled, but otherwise seemed to be fine. That's good. He should be all right then. I'm sure they will have them out fairly quickly, Minerva said, taking another sip of tea. I still can't believe what all has taken place in the last few weeks, Albus said with a sigh. A part of me believes it's all rubbish, but I can't justify those feelings because of all that has happened. I've been going over my copy of the book written by Salazar Slytherin, and he was indeed looking for a way to become immortal. Does it say how he accomplished it? She asked. Albus shook his head tiredly. No, but it's still hard to come to terms with it. However, I look at all they have done and I can't deny it. The Golden Pillar in Harry's first year, the Snake Pit, Peeves, Helena Ravenclaw going to them about the diadem, and the castle itself. I always wondered how Harry managed to get out of my office that night in his first year. The castle let him out. That was the night he blew up this office, and yes, I already know you obliviated me, she said with a slight scowl. Albus buried his face in his hands. I've made a right fool of myself, haven't I? I dare say so, Minerva replied. Mr. Potter is also responsible for the badges that year because the Founder's enchantments are activated by blood magic, though the castle took it upon herself to activate Ravenclaws the night you tried to kill them. Albus sighed heavily. They don't trust me, do they? Not completely, she answered truthfully. But they are willing to work with you. Your extensive knowledge about you-know-who is very valuable. No one knows him better than you do. If anyone can help in the search for the Horcruxes, it's you. That's if Harry is still willing to fight. You heard what he said after the verdict came in, Albus said in a slight worrying tone. Minerva chuckled. Albus, Harry Potter may not be there to finish off you-know-who, but Salazar Slytherin sure will. You have to understand something about him. He may say and do a lot of things, but he is a master at deception and misdirection. He is cunning, resourceful, determined, and ambitious. He is the very embodiment of Slytherin, because he is Slytherin. And Godric? Albus asked. Minerva laughed loudly. He is every bit the Gryffindor we have come to idealize him as. They are best friends though, and one cannot function without the other, at least not very well. They are like brothers in fact. They fuss, fight, poke fun, and play pranks on each other, but at the end of the day, if you mess with one, the other isn't far behind, and then you have to deal with the both of them, she said with a grin. It's ironic really, one of the past headmasters said. The two houses have spent centuries despising each other, when all along their very founders are the best of friends. It makes those of us who molded ourselves after a cold, dark wizard, pure-blooded activist seem very stupid, Phineas Black said with a loud sigh. Indeed, another headmaster said with amusement, causing Phineas to glare at him. Make no mistake about it, Minerva said, looking over at them. Mr. Potter. Salazar. Can be considered a dark wizard, but just as he said back in his first year, not all dark wizards are created equal. I do believe he told Ron Weasley that, and I quote, Salazar Slytherin was a dark wizard, but he looks like a fluffy bunny rabbit compared to you-know-who. She chuckled. However, he knows more dark magic than you-know-who could ever hope to learn, and lucky for us, he's not afraid to use it. That's what worries me, Albus said, glancing sharply at her. Minerva sighed loudly. Albus, you have to realize that Salazar is going to do what he sees fit, as he sees fit. He will take everyone's opinion under advisement, and he will back down if the majority thinks it's best, but if sees an open opportunity to strike, he will, she said with deadly seriousness. No one is saying that you have go about killing people if a battle breaks out, but Salazar, and Godric for that matter, will. They are not stupid though. They know that sometimes you have to take prisoners, so they are not going to go into battle looking to slaughter all of their opponents. Give them some credit, Albus. They have lived 1,000 years after all. Albus sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. I suppose you're right, Minerva, but will they listen to anything I have to say? Will they take my advice and suggestions under advisement? I mean, in all honesty, I kind of feel useless. You're not useless, Albus, but I do think you need to be a little more open to the ideas and suggestions of other people. Aberforth is convinced you have a Merlin complex, and all this nonsense about your greater good is looked upon with scorn and disgust. Take what happened to young Mr. Weasley in second year for instance. It's only by Merlin's good graces that you didn't end up dead. They would have killed you and blown up your office looking for that diary. A child's life was at stake, and I think you know how that made you look to, not just Salazar and Godric, but to everyone. The Weasleys are still hot under the collar over that. Albus sighed heavily as tears sprang up in his eyes. I have a lot to make up for, he said quietly. Yes, you do, Minerva said in all seriousness, but then she sighed. Albus, I shouldn't say this, but there is a lot you don't know. There is a lot you won't know until you prove yourself trustworthy in their eyes. They can look past all your actions from this last year because they weren't your own, and Salazar can look past all that you have done to him, because as he so plainly puts it, he's an adult and can handle it. He can look past the abuse of the Dursleys that you stuck him with, he can look past all the crap you tried to pull with him in first year. He doesn't care how you treated him. He cares about how you have placed this school and its students in danger. He cares about how you blatantly ignored Mr. Weasley's situation in order to carry out your own agenda. He cares about how you disregarded the entire student body's safety when you lured you-know-who here because of the stone, and he cares about how you let Sirius rot in Azkaban for 11 years. It's not how you treat him, or even Godric, it's how you treat other people, especially people they love and care about. Albus looked at her thoughtfully with sad eyes. I think I am beginning to understand, he said quietly as he nodded. But I honestly don't know what to do now. Prove to them that you can be trusted. Reform the order, let the former members who don't know them know exactly who they are. Swear them to secrecy, because I agree with Nicholas. Who they are doesn't need to get out into the general public, because it will only distract them from the real problem, which is you-know-who. However, when you reform the order, don't let it be like it was the last time. Lily strongly advocated killing in self-defense if need be, yet you always instructed everyone use non-violent charms and things. You can't win a war like that. You need to be a little more open-minded. It is part of what Mr. Potter was getting at in the hospital wing when he mentioned using fear as a weapon. You know who does not fear the order, because he knows that we play fair, more than fair actually. If we are going to help Mr. Potter keep his wayward heir in line and keep innocent people from dying, then you know who needs to fear not only you, but everyone, and that includes the whole order. Severus says that Voldemort still doesn't believe Harry's claims, Albus said with a sigh. Oh, I think he will before long, and Severus can do a lot to help with that, Minerva replied. I suppose that's true. Albus nodded. All right, Minerva. I thank you very much for being honest with me today. It's one of the reasons you are my right hand, he said fondly as he gave her a small, appreciative smile. I will do all I can to help. I will reform the order, just as I said in the hospital wing. If I recall correctly, there was talk about Mr. Nilram having a place we can use, but we all need to come together so that we can talk about it. Maybe the Weasleys will afford us a stopover until everyone can learn of the new headquarters. I will certainly run that by the Weasleys and I will speak to Mr. Nilram, Minerva said as she stood up. No doubt that Mr. Ruffin will send Nehum to fetch Mr. Potter from Azkaban before long, she said with a sigh, but then she chuckled. I do believe we are more worked up over him being sent there than he is. Harry won't be able to come back to school though. They will be looking for him, and Fudge has already said that he is going to be sending someone from the ministry to evaluate us and everything we do. Who is he sending?" she asked with instant fire in her eyes. "I have no idea yet," Albus replied as he shook his head. Minerva scowled at the very notion of being watched like a hawk, but then she chuckled. "Well, I'm sure we will figure out something, and as for Mr. Potter's situation, I'm certain that he will figure out where to go from here. He is a Slytherin after all." Albus chuckled as well. "That he is." Albus watched her nod and take her leave, then he sighed loudly and leaned back in his chair. He was still uncertain about some of the things Minerva had said, such as the use of deadly force, but he was determined to prove himself trustworthy, so he decided to go with it for now, and see how it all worked out. It was shortly after Albus had left when Fudge came bustling back into the cell block, red-faced from not only anger, but Salazar's stinging jinx. It had made him laugh loudly, but Fudge wasn't in the mood to play around, and barked at Salazar's guards to stun him. Salazar had scowled at him, and managed to block only 3 of the stunners. So it wasn't a shock to him when he was awakened by once again hitting his head hard on solid stone. He immediately knew he was in Azkaban, due to the cold and the effects of the dementors that were already setting in, but he picked himself up, stumbling somewhat from the concussion he was sure he had, and turned around just as the cell door slammed shut. "Have a nice stay, Potter. The Dark Lord sends his regards." Dawlish hissed. There were no other guards around, and Salazar's vision cleared somewhat. It allowed him to take a look at his surroundings. Apparently he was in a high-security ward. "My friends," Dawlish called out loudly. "Fresh blood for you all to taunt and tease. The one, the only Harry Potter. The boy who lived has been convicted of murdering Pettigrew." He laughed. Laughter, sneering, jeering, and cheers sprang up from every Death Eater cell, but Salazar only scowled. "Worry not, my friends. The Dark Lord comes for you all soon, and we will all be reunited," Dawlish called out happily, but then he turned to Salazar. "And when he does, he will finish you off once and for all, Potter. Or is it Salazar Slytherin?" He laughed. "Potter says, no he dares is more like it, to claim to be the reincarnated soul of Salazar Slytherin himself," he cried, causing the Death Eaters to spat vulgar obscenities at Salazar. "The Dark Lord has no need to entertain such foolish notions though, so do not be fooled by this pretender. We come soon, so rejoice," he cried, causing chaos to erupt from each cell. "What's going on back there?" a distant voice shouted. "Nothing, Franklin," Dawlish shouted back, but then he turned to Salazar once more. "I do believe this used to be Sirius's cell. Maybe he left something for you." He laughed, then with one last happy whoop, he left. "Poor baby Potter. Locked up all alone with us scum." Rabistan Lestrange sneered from the cell next to his. "Come to me, baby Potter. I can be your new mummy." Bellatrix cackled from the one across from him. Salazar just laughed loudly, and walked over to the bars to get a better look at her. "You look like dragon shit, Bella, but thanks to your stupid friend Dawlish, who is clearly a Death Eater we didn't know about until now, I have a few good things to report. Dumbledore will be very interested to know about a planned breakout, and while I may not be able to do anything right now, I look forward to separating your pretty little head from your shoulders. I will kill you if we ever cross paths again. It's the least I can do for the Longbottoms." Her face took on one of excited glee. "Itty bitty Pot knows how to play rough," she shouted gleefully. "But you can't, can you? You want my head? Well, you can't have it," she screamed with fury as she pressed her snarling face against the bars of her cell door. "You can't get out. You can't get out. Ha 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 ha. Potter can't get out," she cackled. "Oh yes I can, Bella. I expect to be out shortly." She whimpered a bit but peered at him closely. "How? You can't get out? You can't get out, baby Potter?" "Yes I can. I can get out the same way Sirius did, but you should know, Sirius is head of the Black family. You've been cast out, as has Narcissa. You, Your sister and her pitiful spineless husband are penniless and are worse off than beggars on the street. Sirius controls the Black family fortune now," Salazar said with a twisted grin. "I'll kill him. I'll kill him," she screamed, grabbing the bars and shaking them back and forth violently, as if she was trying to rip the door off its hinges. "And as for that half-blooded son of a mole you call the Dark Lord, tell him Salazar Slytherin is coming for him. I'm going to kill him for good this time," Salazar said, pressing his face against the bars and grinning at her. "You dare? You dare?" several Death Eaters screamed. "You dare to speak that way about our Lord?" Bellatrix screamed madly. "Half-blooded son of a mole. Half-blooded son of a mole. Half-blooded son of a mole," Salazar bellowed gleefully in a sing-song voice, amidst the screaming protests of the Death Eaters. He knew he was being childish, but he didn't care. He loved to see them so riled up. "He is not. He is not," Bellatrix roared with rage. "Oh, but he is, sweet Bellatrix. You, a staunch, proud pureblood, bow down to a man named Tom Riddle and he is a half-blooded son of a mole," Salazar shouted again, but this time no protests came as a sudden deathly chill descended upon them. They all quickly backed away from their cell doors, and Salazar was no exception. He tried in vain to wandlessly summon up a Patronus, but he couldn't. The combination of lack of sleep and food, not to mention his concussion and earlier wandless exploits, left him floundering around. He curled up in a little ball in the farthest corner of his cell and whimpered slightly, but then, almost as if it had known, a silvery hawk flew through the wall and wrapped its wings around him. "I've got you, my friend," Gordrick's voice said quietly. "I will send him soon. Just hang on a bit longer. We can't be too obvious." Salazar choked back a small sob, but chuckled despite everything going on around him. "Out of all the other times, you pick now to not be a bloody Gryffindor," Salazar mumbled, then squeezed his eyes shut and let the hawk keep the Dementors at bay.
I'm glad you enjoyed the video. Before we close the video, I noticed 53% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel. If you can, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment down below. Until next time, goodbye!